Morning, everyone. Welcome to Pro Landscaper TV Nurture channel. Delighted today to have excellent, top-class, world-class garden designer in Paul Hervey-Brookes, who's well recognized in the industry, highly decorated as a garden designer, and probably most famous for his show gardens, which he's created in the UK many times, as well as in France, Russia, America, New Zealand, and Japan. For which he's been awarded a great many good medals as well. He is also, and perhaps slightly less well known, as a plantsman, and that's something that he and I share a great bond with over. He's a keen gardener, a writer, social media fan, and has a substantial following here. Regular speaker on the horticultural speakers circuit, mentor to young designers, and an avid collector of art and designed items. Originally based in Gloucestershire, Paul's work takes him all over the world, and his designs are often noted as drawing a great deal of inspiration from the place in which he's working. We have worked on many projects together, which is always a delight, and it's a great pleasure to have him here today to talk about a bit about his career, a bit about show gardens, and how he sees show garden system as it stands and how it's going to evolve. We will be hopefully able to take some audience questions, so if you can please add those to the chat if you're watching on Zoom. Just other than that, a very warm welcome to Paul, everyone watching today. And did I cover everything there, Paul? Is that a good intro?
That's amazing, thank you. No, it's nice to be with you, but I get slightly nervous because as the years go by, the ideas don't seem to run out, thankfully, touch wood. You do more and more stuff. It begins to read a bit like an obituary. It's like, I needed this.
Yeah, you don't want it to be like a, here's his past efforts. But I think it's important also that people understand what you do is not just show gardens, and also that what you've done in show gardens has been quite varied. And a lot of designers that perhaps we see at RHS Chelsea, maybe Hampton Court, but the rest of the shows don't get so much coverage, and particularly we don't tend to see the European and further afield shows on TV. So it's good to see that the depth of show experience, even if it may sound a bit like an obituary when read out. Go on, Paul.
I was just saying, I can't, with international shows, I love them because you see the psychology of other designers, and it's then that you realise how much our own design is influenced by the core things we grow up with culturally. Our cultural identity is embedded, and I love international shows because you see that differently. And I like to say it, instead of like all of the places, I just say, I've gone to every show apart from the one in Singapore, and I don't like hot, humid weather, so it doesn't suit my skin.
But it does look like quite an interesting show in many cases in terms of progressive design, the Singapore show. So yes. Before we look at the kind of show circuit and the scene as it stands, I'd like you just to briefly introduce how you approached show gardens for the first time. What got you into it? What were your thought processes, and how prepared were you?
Well, I guess you have to. I also, but we have to accept I was a very different person. It was 2008, the first garden I had done, and also it came about very strangely because, as you say, actually plants were much more interesting to me than design to begin with. So I kind of need to just quickly go a step backwards. I had studied plants, first of all, at Pershall. I then worked for Bob Brown at Cotswold Garden Flowers, and I then went to Edinburgh under George Anderson to study plants. And all I wanted to do was grow plants in the nursery. But he took us on a field trip to Paris, and I was very drunk. I'd gone out one night, and the next day we were supposed to go to this School of Architecture and Design at Versailles, and I thought, this isn't interesting to me. I'm just going to sleep in. Anyway, he banged on the door, and we didn't leave until I got up. Anyway, we went. It was really interesting, but he gave me a prospectus and he said, a nursery will never be enough for your mind, whether you accept it or not, you'll be bored. So take this and think about it. And I thought, oh, what do you know? You know, you've only got an MBE. I'm 18. I know it all, please. So I left Edinburgh and I went to work in Europe in some nurseries and some gardens, and I mean, it was interesting, but, you know, after 3 weeks doing the same thing, I was like, okay, I'm a little bit bored. And I started studying landscape architecture in Versailles under Gilles Clement, who is a genius, but probably one of the only designers alive that I would say is an absolute genius. But I couldn't speak French fully, and I couldn't explain myself. I couldn't understand what was being said. And I came back disheartened, went back to what I knew, which was nursery work, and then enrolled at Cheltenham to do landscape architecture, which was neither setting the world alight nor just making car parks. So it was good. And I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a garden at my local show, which a lot of people start this route. And I'll just be able to show people why I love plants and why I think they're important and how they make spaces for people. So I was completely unprepared. I had no idea of judging. And as a judge now, when a designer says to me, I have not read the judging criteria, I go mad. But I had not read the judging criteria. For me, the judging of the garden by the judges wasn't important. I didn't understand it. But what was important was just saying, this is what I like. And that first garden did very well, but it was a fluke. And this is often the case for first-time designers. The first 2 or 3 times that you win gold, you can't really understand how you've done it, or what it is that makes it a good garden at a show. Brilliant gardens at shows are judge well, but also take in principles which are more suitable to a domestic landscape, which not all show gardens are. So I was unprepared. I did what I thought was best. It just happened to do well. And from there, I thought, you know what, I love doing this. I can speak to people about what I like. They tell me about plants that they like, and I'm going to get paid. And it was like a win-win.
So did you feel that you fluked success then in this first show garden? Was it? I mean, there must have been something behind it that was deliberate and measured that worked, even if you hadn't read the judging criteria fully.
Well, I guess, I mean, from a judging perspective, it was 2-dimensionally and 3-dimensionally very good, because I scaled it at 1:1, which a lot of first-time designers at shows don't do. They don't seem to understand that it is a 1:1 application. And then after that, the design was very basic. It was cruciform. It was about somebody who was kind of growing their own stuff and wanted to make like a cottage garden. For me, I mean, I love making gardens which, you know, are very slick and modern, and okay, cost a lot of money. But also at its core, I don't believe horticulture should be elitist. I don't think it should be about what you can afford. And throughout my career, I've always gone back to gardens which are about what I've grown myself with the cutting that somebody gave me next door as an idea, because I grew up with neighbours who did that for me. And I think no matter, you know, whether you live in a Georgian estate or you live with a balcony, gardening should be accessible.
Yeah, and we've spoken in the past about how the judging doesn't take into account, and also people's assessment of a garden's success doesn't take into account the cost it took to produce. And yet a lot of assessment for, say, professional construction in other fields is assessed based on price point. You know, your categories are assessed by price point. And the show garden world, you can have radically different budgets between people in the same category. Their ability to produce a great garden may be different, and you know, they may be able to do gold with a tiny budget, and other people produce a silver gilt or bronze with a massive budget. I mean, it can work both ways, but it does always seem like a bit of a shame to me that price point isn't mentioned. It isn't expressly mentioned when it comes to judging, so that people can compare apples for apples.
Well, I mean, in Jardin, the show in Paris, they actually put the cost of the garden, one of the criteria. The other thing they do, which is very different, so you see the garden, you are able to read the brief the designer has given as to what they're creating, how much it costs them, and you also read what the judges thought of the garden. It's a different system, and I think it's also culturally different, because particularly in France, the idea of the Republic is equality. So everybody has access to that information. That's what they believe. But what I find interesting with our show garden and professional world is like the APL and those professional awards are by gardens up to 40,000, gardens up to 60, whatever. Fine, that's one way of talking about gardens. And at the shows, I think it's really, really difficult, because I believe that a really gifted, clever show designer can get gold on a budget, but almost anybody can, if you've got enough money, can buy the most beautiful art, the most beautiful materials, the best contractor, and the design element, or the kind of intelligence of the design can slip down the list and not be the primary reason why that garden gets gold.
Do you feel that's common, or is it it's just something you've witnessed over time?
I think almost every year you can see one or two gardens where the quality of the materials, the quality of the construction, the quality of the plants gives enough points to get to gold, but the design is not interesting.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. And going back then to shows in France, do you think that we would be better served to have some of that information brought over to our assessment, judging, and feedback that not just the designer is privy to, but everyone is privy to in our shows? Would you welcome that?
Well, I don't. In one way, I think it would be interesting. In another way, I think from the foundations up, they're very different. So, Chaumont Garden Festival, which everybody knows, and Jardin both rely on a principle which is founded in all of the competitions in France. There is only a maximum of 3 people who will win gold, or in some competitions there's only 1 person who will win gold. The 2 gardens could be gold worthy, but the judges will feel that the 1 garden and the 1 designer, it's their moment, they shine out. They believe that that system makes the other designers work harder to develop their skills to win this 1 coveted prize the next year or the year after. It's a very different way of thinking about competition. Our competition with the RHS is much more anybody can achieve gold, and the competition is self-driven rather than the system promotes the idea that there's only 1 chance this year, and if you don't get it, you're going to have to work much harder next year.
An interesting challenge, the difference between the 2. I suppose they both have their merits, but it would be an interesting exercise to see them reversed and see how successful many gardens might be in France, and also how the feedback might affect people in the UK.
Well, I think one of the things that one of the big differences is also the participation of the numbers of people. So the numbers of people interested in what's happening in French garden shows or garden shows in New Zealand or Japan is much more than the UK. I mean, Napoleon said we were shopkeepers. We are a nation of gardeners, and I think the big problem for the way we look at English shows is that not many of the general public understand judging, and the RHS has done work to try and make that easy, even more accessible for the general public. And the general public judge things much more emotively. Do I like it? Don't I like it? Does it make me feel something? Those kind of thoughts are completely irrelevant in the way that the RHS judges. As a judge, we never look at anything and say, I like it, I don't like it. It's a false statement. So there's a disconnect between how the general public, the journalists and the BBC see it, and what they want to talk about as an emotive garden that's always lovely. It's ye olde little roses with a few lavenders and might be a couple of wildflowers. It's evocative of something we don't have. It's show winning. And what the RHS is looking at across 9 categories of, is this the best possible example of X, Y, Z? And it's how to explain that to the public to allow them to step into the shoes of the judge, which I think would be interesting.
Yeah, I've seen, and I'm sure everybody else has seen, who has designed or supplied or worked on a show garden and been there during a show day has seen a member of the public either fall in love with a garden, and you've seen, you know, heartwarming and wonderful scenes, even tears brought to people's eyes, but you've also probably seen someone look at a garden and declare quite audibly how much they hate it. And the public value and appreciation of what's gone into a garden often isn't there, and that's because it's difficult to portray, I suppose, but also the level of understanding might be different on how, you know, the theme, the inspiration, the motivation behind the design might not be immediately apparent in the visual without reading text and things like that. Makes for an interesting thing, you know, event.
But I think there's also our English system is very complicated. It's muddled because there's also a real difference between, you know, if I go to garden clubs and societies or, you know, speak to people, they say, oh, I really love X designer because they're really good with delphiniums and I like delphiniums. Okay, but there's nothing in your statement there that values their work as a designer. Whereas when you speak to people who are in the industry, be them nursery growers, contractors or designers, the language they use and the evaluation they make is very different, and yet it's all meshed in at the same show. So I think inevitably there's always going to be an element of this group of people will look at it like this group will look at it like this, and it's just, and maybe there's a challenge, maybe there isn't, in how to get all of the different groups at least understanding a bit more of each other.
So you said that you didn't pay much attention to the judging criterion on your first show, and I know now it's something we invariably discuss during the build, and you know, roughly tot up where we think a garden might be. How much has judging changed over the years you've been doing this, to first of all be clearer to everybody understanding the way the gardens are judged, but also in the approach that judges take to assessment?
Well, when I started, it was still under the percentage, so 100%. So it was like 30% for this element, 20% for that element. And it was a lot of people who weren't necessarily designers. But I should say, the second garden I made got Best in Show and Silver Gilt, which I didn't understand. And it was that prompted me to look at the system and think, well, how does that work? Because you can't have Best in Show and Silver Gilt, surely. But in those days you could, because if there was no gold, the Best in Show went to the Silver Gilt. Now, as judges, we debate whether we want to even award Best in Show, whether we think it's appropriate. So it's changed dramatically. But I think it was you that said to me that somebody who's not necessarily a fan of mine said the one thing they admired was that I never make the same mistake twice. So once it was in my head to understand the system, for my own benefit, I wanted to make the best possible job. And the year after that, the system changed to the points, which is 34 points. Well, I think 36 points is maximum. 34 points is almost unheard of. 30 points sweeps the board, essentially, because not many gardens ever get it. And it all, from that point, became my ambition that I would make a garden that got 34 points. And I have done it with the garden at Chatsworth. But the system has changed dramatically, and particularly under Joe Shirley, who did a lot of the work changing from percentage to points, also came an influx of a lot of new judges, of which I was one. And they, you know, the RHS were very open. They said, we don't want the judges to all be the same age, because they all need to have experience. We want more judges who are actively still working, who are engaged with new developments in the industry. And we don't just want them to be a garden designer, or, you know, there are contractors, journalists, photographers, artists, designers and plantsmen on their own, so that within that group of people we can discuss with each other and say, you know, because each of us come with a specialism, we don't all know everything. In fact, none of us do. And so we can talk to each other and have a much more frank discussion. And we're also always referring back to the brief that the designers said. And it's so often now that, and in fact, when I've chaired panels, which I did almost from the first year I was a judge, which again was a bit unusual, but I've always said to the designer, when we meet them in those first 2 minutes, have you got any questions for us? Because, you know, we're not some great being that can't be spoken to. Please ask us. And I will say to the panel, if you've read this and you have a question in your mind, ask the designer now, because we're here to get the best for them. And we need them to know that we are human and we can be spoken to, and we can have a discussion before we even start judging to make sure we're clear what it is we're judging. And the designer has been as clear as they can with us about what it is they want to say. And it's from that that we can form an opinion. It never used to be like that. It used to be that designers cleared the show floor and these great mysterious beings in tweed arrived and they disappeared again. And 2 of them at some point came to pat you on the head and be like, my first feedback was with Elizabeth Banks, and she basically said, yeah, was this all your own work? And I said, no, there was a few people who helped me. She said, well done, you. Walked off. That way, okay, but that's not really constructive feedback.
Yeah, it's nice that it's positive, but you're not really learning anything from it. And I suppose that you know, at the end of the day, the only value of feedback is for you to learn from the experience, so that the next time you're not going to repeat those mistakes. You know, as you brought up earlier.
I mean, there are 2 things. When I give feedback, I make it very clear that I say to designers, look, designing a domestic garden, whatever the scale, is different to designing at a show. Some principles overlap, some are completely different. And then I go through the different elements with them. With me, there are always 2 chairmen. There's chairman of judging, chairman of assessing together, and we will say, you told us this. If I said that to you, what would you think? Because you've told 7 people are going to come back to you with 7 different points of view, depending on how you phrase this sentence. And the key to me has always been, as a designer, you are providing answers to the physical garden you've made. You're not giving a whole new list of questions, because we're all going to come up with our own answer. We don't want that. We need to know what it is you intended to do, and we then apply that across 9 criteria where we are looking at it completely from a point of view, does it do X, Y, and Z? You told us it was this. Is that what's happening?
Do you feel there's anything else that we need to do to improve judging and assessment and feedback? Is there something that, from the perspective of a designer, rather than from the perspective of a judge and assessor, moderator, where do you feel judging needs to be refined in order to just improve the whole process for everyone?
I actually think it needs to come from the designer, and I would say this as a designer, not, as you say, not as a judge, but as a designer. So many designers go into these shows either missing the point that they are in competition purely with themselves and begin to see what other people are doing and modify their own design because they don't have the confidence of their design, or they enter the show expecting something which is ultimately doomed to failure, and then they take out their frustration on the judges because they didn't get what they believed they deserved. Well, I grew up with the phrase that self-praise is no recommendation, and in this industry it is not. So the designers actually need to be serious. I'm going to put everything I've got into this garden. I'm going to expect nothing back in return, nothing more than what 7 people ultimately, through careful analysis, believe it's worth. And I am jolly well going to listen to what they're saying to me, because if I'm new to this industry and they've been kicking around 20 years, they might have something useful to say to me. And I think quite a lot of the issues that we have at the moment are with designers who expect possibly more than they deserve at that moment in time, and then don't behave in the best possible way for their own credit afterwards, and kind of muddy the whole waters because they feel they've in some way been treated unjustly. And I can honestly say all of the gardens that I've made that have been judged, if I look back at them now, I would agree with where they have gone. Not necessarily the reasoning behind what happened, but I would agree with the medal. And I would also say, as a judge, I have never been in a position where we have all said, let's just do that, who cares? we take it very seriously, and we want the best for the industry because it's an industry that we care passionately about. It's not just about dishing out a few medals and having a free lunch.
Yeah, I suppose there's the I know how seriously judging is taken, and having seen it, and it's not something that many people get to see. I suppose that it becomes difficult to, without having gone through the process, understand, you know, the reasoning and the effort that goes into it. And I suppose the other thing is that designers may have high expectations of their work, and a lot of that is going to be because they put a lot into it. You know, it's an investment in time and effort.
I'm not sure it is.
Well, you know, maybe not always, definitely, but I think it's part of it. But the other thing that a lot of people have a tendency to do is to surround themselves with people who are going to offer praise rather than criticism, and that's one of the biggest risks, because it's far less helpful than having the one person there who will throw a really critical eye over your work while it's being built and planted.
If there's one thing that I have learned, is that particularly as you go up the career ladder and it looks like your profile's ballooning, there are lots of people who want to be nice to you and tell you you're wonderful. Danger is in believing the hype that you are wonderful, because there'll be a huge fall. The person in the background who honestly says to you when you draw something on paper and you show it to them, they say, "Is that the best you can do?" That's the person you need. It's the person that when you show them the garden says, "That's not what you told me you were going to do." That's the person you need, because the only way you can improve your own design skills is not through flattery. It's through thinking, okay, was that the best? Have I really achieved that? What if I do this instead? What if I listen to that person who says, "Are you sure?" Because to me, that's the only way anybody can improve. I mean, nobody picks a paintbrush and knocks out Picasso the first time. It takes time to refine your skills, and it's through refining your skills you understand who you are as a designer.
Yeah, and you want people to reflect on the brief through the process without you. I often think that it can become very difficult to become objective when you're so entrenched in the process that that brief that you had a really clear vision of on paper might not be being realized in real life. And you're looking for a very harsh person, but there's also the person who can go, "What about if you did that? Would that not better reflect?" The kind of constructive constructive feedback at the point of build.
Well, I mean, yes, you need someone you trust to be honest with you about what you're doing. What you don't need. I mean, my heart goes cold when I see really nice people who email and say, "Oh, I love gardening. I'd love to come and help. I'll be able to give you some of my ideas." And I think, okay, I don't really, the best will in the world, I don't want your ideas. I don't need to augment what I want to do with maybe this, maybe that, maybe that, maybe that, because it's not pick and mix. On the showground, what I need is a team who do exactly what they're asked without interpretation, without deviation, in exactly the way that I, or in many cases Andrew or Gareth, have said, because it's me and the contractor who are making the decisions day by day, and it is the team who are implementing them as we've asked, not as they think we might like. It's a completely different thing.
I've spoken to a number of young designers or entry show garden designers in the last month who are about to or looking to, and that's the advice that I've been giving, which is that you're not going to have the budget to pay millions of people to do lots of different tasks. So a lot of what you're going to have to do is rely upon friends and family, but only take the people who will just follow instruction rather than interpret and do what they think is right.
And the other thing, I think the thing that stands young or first-time designers out, you can separate them out quite easily, is those where you've seen they have quietly gone to other people's builds and done what's been asked of them by that person. So they've experienced each of these steps so that they can explain to their team what it is they want them to do. Because, I mean, for argument's sake, let's say the plants need watering. I would never say to somebody on my team, please go and water those plants. What does it mean? Go and water them. Well, you know, one person might waft the hose over the whole lot and they're all burnt by the sun. Lovely. One person might put the water in a tray of one set of plants and think, well, those ones in the tray need watering because they're in a tray. There's not enough information. Every step of these gardens, if you really want to kind of show the best of what it is you're doing, needs to be explained. So, you know, I say, please water them. This is how I like it done. I make a demonstration. The visual demonstration is much easier than a long-winded explanation. They understand, I go away, I come back and check because, you know, once they think I'm out of sight, they might start just wafting it around. But it takes time, and you have to do that if you're committing yourself to the world stage. With Chelsea, it's over 1 billion people interact with each show. So I'm not going to put myself in a position where what I do, I'm not proud of.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Let's give some new designers. They may be very experienced garden designers, but new show garden designers. Let's give them some of your top advice then on what they must do in order to not necessarily ensure success, but to ensure that they're going to have the garden that they want to design. Because I think when you go chasing medals, you're more likely to be disappointed than happy. But how to, Paul Hervey-Brookes' top tips, how to be a good show garden designer.
Okay, so the first thing, I would make sure I've understood the judging criteria. It's important because you're putting yourself in that situation for the feedback. Number two, I would think to myself, am I doing this because I want a gold medal? Or am I doing this because I want to showcase my work? If it's because I want to showcase my work, that's a reason to do it. If it's because I want a gold medal, it's never going to happen. Because it's the wrong energy to bring to the show. So once you've kind of had those two conversations, when you're physically on the showground, the first thing is to have a plan of each day what it is you want to achieve with your contractor. For me, it's a conversation we have every day. Today we are going to do X, Y, and Z because we need to be at this point by this point. Also, and I've made gardens without a contractor on my own. It's hard work, it can be done. But when there's a contractor, for me, they're in charge of the entire build so that I'm free to dip in and out of each bit which I want to achieve. I like to take a photo at the end of every day, and I don't look at it until I've gone back to the hotel or the tent, wherever we're staying, and I look at it with the contractor, and we kind of, from that photo, we say, that isn't as good as we thought. On the showground, it looked great, but actually it's not great. So we can go back and change it. It kind of gives a little bit of impartiality because it's like looking at somebody else's garden. I like the plants to arrive in a sequence that I know I can deal with. I don't want them all there at one go because they take up a lot of space, for one thing. Other people are trying to use the showgrounds, things are getting damaged. It's not great. I try and get them in the areas that I'm planting by. Plant without the pots, never borrow the plants, always buy them. You can get donations of timber, paving, all of that kind of stuff, but never with the plants because A, you're not going to be able to provide them back to the nursery in the condition they gave them to you. And B, they won't look like a real garden if you put them all in pots because you can't water them properly, they won't mesh together. The most crucial thing in all of this is not to still be cleaning, raking, planting, anything on assessing day. The garden is finished the day before assessing, ideally the day before that, to allow plants to come together to look more natural, and also to allow the assessors to psychologically approach the garden and think, okay, they've had a nice smooth build, it's all looking good, it's fresh, the plants are perky, it's clean, they might be laying the turf around the outside, fine. They might be watering the track, that's fine. But for assessors, it looks good. It means you've had time to tidy up the back of the garden, the bits that the public don't see, but trust me, judges and assessors walk all the way around. They want to look at any corners you've tried to cut. And it also gives you time for early media, because they start arriving with the assessors almost, so it gives you time to talk relaxed, comfortably about what it is you're doing, rather than, I can't really talk to you right now, so I've got to get this done. And I think after that, during the show, the three main things which I always think about is never, even if you've had a bad experience with an investor, never talk about it and say, oh, well, they didn't really like that. It's not cool. You know, they've committed to making a garden with you. You need to commit to being with them for the show. The general public don't need to know about the horror show of my car breaking down, my this, that, the other. You're a professional. Present yourself as a professional. And the last thing, because you will get caught out, is what we don't want to see is the designers saying to the public, well, the judges said they didn't like my choice of colour. Judges are never going to say that. And invariably, I'm going to be walking past, like I did 2 years ago, hearing what the judges told the designer, and I will stop you and I will say to them, actually, I am the judge and I did say X, Y, Z. I didn't say that. So it's about being professional, it's about being prepared, and it's about thinking all the way about giving yourself time, because there's only 2 weeks maximum, and you need to make those 2 weeks feel like 4. So it's planning, careful thought, delivering a professional thing that you can stand back and say, regardless of the medal, this is the best work I've been able to achieve to this day.
That's some great advice there, you know, for anybody who's looking to do it. And I think most of it actually comes down to professionalism in one way or another. But it's important that you make something that you're proud of, but also something that reflects what you tried to achieve, and that you are professional with everyone on site and you conduct yourself in a manner that you would like to see others conduct themselves. So anybody taking anything from that, I mean, that last 5 minutes is going to be incredibly valuable to your future success. Paul, there's got to be a buzz, an obsession, something that keeps people going back for more show gardens. You know, we've seen people, and you've had it yourself in the past, where this is not necessarily been the success that you'd hoped for, but you keep going back and you enjoy it. You must doubt yourself at times, but tell people about the gamut of emotions that you experience, from doubt and concern through to the elation and the want to do it again.
I see making gardens at shows as a huge privilege, and I don't say it as like some chocolate bars. Oh, it's such a privilege to be here. What I mean is, it's an amazing moment where a company, a professional, respected business like Viking, who I've worked with a number of times now, will come to you and say, we want what's in your head. We're going to pay, you know, budgets range from 50 to £250,000. We're going to pay £250,000 up front for you to create something that we won't see until we've paid for it. That in itself is the most extraordinary feeling of someone having confidence in you that you can possibly have. And we all, no matter what point we're in life, we all doubt ourselves for a variety of reasons. You know, maybe my ideas aren't good enough. Maybe you know, if I really try not to do it, but I know it's very easy to compare yourself with other people. Why haven't I got what they've got? Why aren't I doing this? Why aren't I doing that? So when somebody comes along and they says, we want you, we want what's in your head to do this for us, it's extraordinary. And then they provide, sometimes one word, sometimes pages worth of information about what it is they want you to interpret into a garden. And it's only really at the show that you can make a garden which is purely artistic and creative. Domestic gardens, yes, you're being creative design solutions, you're being artistic planting, but always at its heart, it is a functioning garden for the person who owns it. A show garden doesn't have to be for, we sometimes invent a client when they say this garden is intended for these two imaginary people, but these imaginary people are the perfect person in our head that's not going to deviate from what it is we want it to make. So in fact, the garden at the show is always pure art, and there's nothing better than having somebody allow you to do that and show 1 million people plus what's in your head. And if you've managed to get a good photograph of it, it lasts forever, and it's a garden that, like people still talk about Bunny Guinness in the bloody treehouse. It's that sort of thing. If it's good, it will outlive you, and there's not much that will outlive you.
Yeah, I mean, it is a privilege, really, when you consider that someone has to put a huge amount of money on hope that you're going to do something great. And in some cases, that's with a new designer. It's not necessarily always with people with previous experience. So yeah, no, it's a challenge, but an honor and a buzz, I'm sure. 2020, obviously, we had no shows to speak of, really, and it was a pretty sad time horticulturally. We've got a lot of issues in 2021, which we're working our way through as best we can. Hopefully, we're going to see some shows this year, and it's certainly looking increasingly more likely. How do you feel, focusing mostly on the UK, how do you feel the RHS handled shows, the absence of shows in 2020? We've seen our first RHS digital shows, and I'd like to hear what you have to think about them.
Well, I mean, for people who don't realise it, the team at the RHS is very small for shows, in particular it's a team, and they're working a year plus in advance for each show. So I think the wind was cut from the sails fairly late on. So it was a big shock, and I think for all of us, you know, it's very easy a year later to say, well, if I would have done X, Y, Z. Well, of course we would, because we've had a year to think about what we would have done. But at that moment in time, I think they were thinking, first of all, you know, like all of us, maybe it isn't going to be a year plus of issues with this pandemic. So let's hang on. But, you know, speaking to them since, they care so passionately, they were so hardworking at trying, first of all, to keep it going, then accept it has to change. Talking to thousands of exhibitors about, okay, you've committed to this, but we can't do it. Are you okay? Can you carry your ideas over to another year? What happens when they can't? So they had all of that, and then they came up with the virtual Chelsea. And I think some of the best elements of virtual Chelsea will carry on into future years when there are real shows, because not everyone can visit the show, and there's content that can be provided by the RHS through a whole range of experts they've got on hand, that, you know, either directly employed by them or designers and nurserymen, that makes it really interesting. So I think they did the best they could. I think they've learned a lot from it about actually how to improve the actual shows when they take place.
I completely agree. I think it was a huge challenge for them. You're right, it's a small shows team. The RHS shows team, they achieve a great deal with not that many people. And I know that they were all heartbroken that they couldn't do it, but to produce a virtual Chelsea was amazing, and then to you know, carry it on into other shows. I want to see virtual shows becoming a component part of physical shows, much more so, because it is a great leveler, allowing people who couldn't necessarily get to Chelsea on any given year to be able to see some of the talks, to see some of the behind the scenes footage, and really useful information from their own house. And I think that it's something that I really hope doesn't disappear in the future. So if we then look at this year, 2021, we've got our September Chelsea, the first time. What are your feelings on this? I mean, for me, it's an interesting one. It's challenging. I really am not sure what to expect, and we're producing for it, and I don't know quite how it's going to be delivered. But I'm quite excited.
Well, I mean, I've got to say, on a personal note, I have a gold medal from the 100th Chelsea, and it's only going to happen once. And I kind of feel like maybe this is only going to happen once, and I would love to be making something.
Okay.
Watching, but I mean, for me, it's really interesting from a plant perspective, because we're used to seeing like Aquilegia, Allium, Steeplopteris. There's only so many times you can really put those three plants together in the same copper container and call it exciting. So I kind of feel like there's a whole host of plants we haven't seen. And yes, we may see them at Tatton, we may see them at Malvern in the autumn now that they've started having gardens again, but they don't get the same exposure of Chelsea. And I can say this with all honesty, I've spoken about making gardens in Canada and different places, and I say, I got gold at Hampton Court. Oh, that's nice. I say I got gold at Chelsea. People give you a round of applause. So Chelsea has the potential to showcase a whole new range of plants in a way that no other show can. So for me, that's really exciting. And I think done well, and I'm sure the RHS is throwing everything at it, it has quite an amazing potential to show us more than a few Heleniums and Rudbeckias in combination with late season alliums. I want to see more than that. And if designers are only coming up with the traditional fallbacks, then they've missed the whole point of doing it.
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to the idea of seeing things pushing more in the way of seed heads and fruits as an interesting adage that we're not so used to at Chelsea. But I think it will be that potentially is quite a good challenge for a lot of the designers doing it. Yeah, so we'll see, I think, is the message there, and we might even see you there doing something, building something. Fingers crossed. Talk me briefly through the show year, your show year as a designer, first of all, and then what you experience as a judge going through the different shows. Well, let's do it fairly quickly because I want to get onto some of the questions that have been asked.
Well, I mean, as a designer, it depends on the year, because in some years I've done like 2 shows internationally and a UK show. Some years I've only done one show. Each garden for me takes about 6 to 8 months of my time up. If it's big, and if it's international, then it's much harder because we're dealing with long distance trying to find things. And you're roughly a month on the showground. But I think the very quick crucial thing is, if you're looking for an investor, if you say to them, I want 50 grand in it's going to be a week, then that's not really going to work. Social media engagement and brand loyalty is a year-round process, and that garden is part of their marketing budget, and it needs to work for 12 months of their marketing. So in fact, with Brew and Dolphin, who I've worked with a lot, my show year as a designer actually incorporates 12 months worth of meeting their clients, doing seminars, doing workshops, giving them information about what to do in their garden, and inviting them to participate in the making of their garden, because it is their garden when they pay for it. And as a judge, it's basically getting the briefs, reading them, researching anything that I don't know. Some people talk about specific paintings or specific aesthetic movements. I research that. We meet as a team, and we spend 2 days in advance of the show looking and judging, and a day with the designers after, giving feedback.
Brilliant. Right, here's an inane question that I'm going to give you. It's from me. What's your favorite show and why? Anywhere in the world.
I think it's Chelsea. I just think it's Chelsea because for me, it's like a family. For Andy McIndoe took me under his wing and let me build with him when he was still doing the Hillier exhibits. Different people who've been important in my life have been at Chelsea. George Anderson I hadn't seen for about 5 years, and then I saw him at Chelsea. I was nervous, and I said, "Oh, hi, do you remember him?" He was like, "Yes, of course I do. What are you doing?"
We were together when you saw him, actually, weren't we? We were in the Floral Marquee. I remember.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, there isn't anything else like Chelsea. And around the world, it is respected as the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm slightly different. I prefer Hampton Court, and I think it's because it's less of a nightmare from the perspective of a grower to produce for Hampton Court than it is for Chelsea. I like the Hampton Court site as well. But yeah, everybody's got their own favourite, I think, and it's interesting to hear the reasons why. We've had a number of questions in, and I'd like to sort of run through them. There were a couple that actually you almost touched upon, which were looking at budget, and we've got who have we got? We had a question on budget. Yeah, so Stephen Bennett's asked about on the question of show budgets being declared, taken into account by assessors and judges. He wants to turn the question around and say, would you know if how would you know if a garden was generously resourced, is sponsored, containing a wealth of materials? Was it something that you could identify just visually, or do you think people could would need to be informed? Do sponsors and judges, you know, is there a relationship between the two, and do we feel that the show is better for having varied budgets?
Well, if it's the Stephen Bennett, no. So I mean, basically, I think most of us could walk past gardens that have had a very high budget, and we would be able to see that through the size of the trees, through the choice of materials. You can see when it's expensive materials, but you can also see expensive materials and really poor quality creativity. You can see really inexpensive materials and amazing creativity. I mean, I think about a garden I saw at Malvern. It was tiny, it was 5 meters round. It got best in show, must have cost 30,000, when a garden costing 3 times more just didn't have the same wow of creativity. So yes, you can see it. I think professionals probably in the industry can add it up a lot easier than the general public, I can say. But I'm unsure as to, if we just said, you know, on Main Avenue Church, let's say, garden number 1, it costs 69,000. Garden number 2 costs 300,000. Without any context, it's a pointless figure, because generally going to say, well, okay, but why? So there's no point giving an answer if we haven't provided the context of why we're telling people how much each garden costs.
Could a breakdown be a useful thing for people to see of where the money was spent? I don't
think it's that straightforward also, because if you spend £60,000 on a garden at home, you're going to get a very, very different garden to a garden that you spend £60,000 at the show for. Because at a show, generally, there's a lot more bespoke materials being made, used, created. There's artists being engaged. There's accommodation and food and hotel, transport costs. There's the cost of going backwards and forwards to the meetings for the whole year with the person who's paying for it. The contractor is away from home. The people they employ are generally on a slightly higher rate because they're all away from home and they're working much longer hours. The plants need much more care, much more attention at the nursery. So, you know, you would anticipate you're paying more for the plant. So the cost is already inflated. And the danger of saying, on average, these gardens cost £150,000 is that people think, well, I'm never going to be able to afford to do that, so I might as well give up. And that's the flip side of this coin. If you keep telling people it costs this huge amount, it's off-putting. And there's no need to do that, because you can talk about so many other things that show that actually engages the audience.
And I suppose there's the contrast in a lot of gardening TV, where the actual cost isn't very fairly reflected. You know, it's actually massively underpriced for what it would cost to produce, and people get a different impression of how much it costs to produce a garden. So between the two, perhaps an answer lies. Stephen's actually asked another question: as a designer of show gardens, how does Paul tackle the difficult chicken and egg issue of having a sponsor who may not commit until the design has been accepted, and on the other hand, a show organizer who will not accept the design until a sponsorship is confirmed?
Well, so basically, I can answer this quite easily. If you apply to the RHS, particularly with a design and a sponsor who is interested, then it can go through the first round of pre-show assessing. So there are 3 meetings that generally take place. It's at the last meeting, if you still haven't got a confirmed sponsor, where they say, look, we can't have this. Also, what I would say is, if those 3 meetings start in July, they finish at Christmas. If in those 6 months your potential investor hasn't committed, then they're not going to commit, and you've got to be realistic. I have never gone out and chased a sponsor. I've been in one way, very lucky that sponsors have come to me. But I think what's important about this relationship is you're not asking for money to build your fantasy, and they're not giving you money on the off chance at the last minute you might make a garden. You are a team together. You have the same shared values, or else it doesn't work. Their audience is your audience, or it doesn't work. And so in that very nature, the commitment comes really early because you believe in each other, you both want to create this thing, and 9 times out of 10, it's only happened to me once where it's the sponsors had to pull out, and that was for a specific reason. But 9 times out of 10, they're writing the letter saying they're confirming, and they're paying their first instalment very, very quickly.
Yeah, and Stephen's gone to slightly correct what I asked there, which was to say that how could an assessor or judge know if the actual value has been declared? So there's a question of really, is there a full declaration of spend, or does it matter really in terms of assessment?
Well, the pre-show selection panel, the selection panel, is made up of 4 judges. One of those judges will either become an assessor for that category or a judge for that category. So at least one on the panel will have an insight into the amount of money that was declared. But also, it's secondary information, because as judges, we are judging what we see on the day. The assessors judge what they see on assessing day. They report back to the judges overnight. In the morning, as a team, we have a presentation and we judge exactly what we see there and then. We don't judge how much might they have spent. We don't get to judge how well behaved were they through the build. Did they cause problems for the on-site team? Did they have hiccups? Did they have this? Did they have that? For us, all of that background information currently is not part of our decision making. And I think if we start saying one element of the kind of lead up to a finished garden is taken into consideration, then for me, we should also be taking into consideration how professionally did that whole team behave during the build? Because it's not just a question of money. I mean, we all know internally, some teams focus, get on, quiet, couldn't ask for more, clean up their site at the end of the day. Some, it's everywhere. It's a nightmare to have them as a neighbour, frankly. That's not taken into consideration at the moment. So for me, we either take everything in, or we just do as we are now, what I see on the day.
Brilliant. Lynn has asked about the difference. She's asked for 3 examples, but whatever you can come up with in the next 2 minutes maximum, of the differences between designing for a client who is asking you for a show garden and a client who is looking for a domestic garden that they will live in. What are your 3 kind of key overarching differences in your approach?
Okay, so the principal difference is that a show garden, the one thing you have that lasts is a photograph. So your boundaries are actually the point you design from. How do I make it so that I've got 2 solid areas to take a decent photo? Number 1. Number 2, the audience needs to be able to look in, but they can't get in. So the way a show garden is planted is up and down, much more so than a domestic garden, because you're providing views in. With a domestic client, you are providing design solutions with creativity. It's a completely different thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Tim, our friend Tim, has asked, or actually he's made a couple of interesting points. And that he, first of all, his main point is the judging criteria for show gardens should take into account originality of design. He feels that that's a real benefit to the approach. Your comment, I mean, that is part of the assessment criteria as it stands. And as a photographer, he goes on to say he personally judges a show garden on how photogenic it is, which I suppose a lot of visitors to shows are doing the same kind of idea. And he's identified some bronze medal gardens as being far more photogenic than others that have perhaps achieved a gold. Is that recognized at all in judging criteria?
Okay, let's just start with originality. Originality is one of the elements in our judging criteria. But what we have to remember is that there is nothing new. So it's the original interpretation of that idea that we're looking at. How originally, how was the designer's concept? So let's take a cruciform garden with a terminating vista and there's an urn at the end. We've seen it 1,000 times. What did this designer do that was original to them to make the idea look new? if they've done that successfully, their mark will be higher. If it's fairly standard and boring, their mark's going to be low. It's like, well, you know, is that Paul Hervey-Brookes or is it Jenny Bond? Who knows? It just looks pretty similar. So that's where we look at originality. In terms of photogenics, it's an emotive quality. One person, I say this without any disrespect, but one person might look at, you know, a photo by Tim or by Jerry Harper or by Clive Nichols and think, oh, I really don't like that. And another one's going to look at it and think, that's the best photo I've ever seen. It's impossible to judge that. So we judge purely on non-emotive basis.
Yeah, very important point, actually. The non-emotive element is something which is the great leveler again. You know, there has to be grounding in fact rather than in even your love of a designer over another designer, or I've seen their work before and it was great. It's all about what's in front of you against criteria.
Exactly.
Look, we could ask about 1,000 more questions quite easily, and I'm sure you and I could quite happily talk for a few more hours, but we must draw it to a close today. I'd like to thank everyone watching. I'd especially like to thank Paul for joining me, and I had a great time and I hope you all did too. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone watching, and I look forward to speaking to someone else on our next Nurture Channel Pro Landscaper TV episode. Thank you. Bye for now.